In the second half of the 19th century, the pace of change really quickens. The Industrial Revolution enters its second phase with the rise of steel, electricity, chemicals, the automobile industry, among others. More rural workers flock to increasingly overcrowded and unsanitary cities. Science reigns supreme, and philosophers and social scientists attempt to make every discipline scientific using the empirical process, observation, what can be observed. Darwin uses science to challenge religious concepts of creation and human life. Marx uses at least his interpretation of economic science to challenge the social order. And a rising generation of artists challenges the conventions of Academy-approved painting. Okay, you do not need to worry about knowing all of these modernist styles now. We're only going to talk about the first three of these movements in this unit. But now may be a good time to explain that the term modernism, as we use it in art history, actually describes the intellectual and artistic movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So much of what we call modern art historians actually call postmodern art, or they pin it with a confusing array of labels that, alas, we are going to need to learn in the next unit. So, have you been waiting for the next generation to turn on their artistic moms and dads? Well, those romantics, they were so sentimental, they were so given to unnecessary drama. Yes, many were engaged in current social issues. Think of the raft of the Medusa or the slave ship. But how many of them took to the barricades? Did they get their hands dirty? Did they consort with real poor people? To the realists that succeeded them, the world of the romantic artists lived in a world that was still, well, too pretty. Time for some gritty reality. Or at least sometimes time for gritty reality. As we're going to see, one important strand of realism, the Barbizon school, actually returned to what superficially seemed to be more romantic landscape paintings. But as we'll see, they have a strong realist influence as well. But first, we'll turn to the gritty side of realism. Courbet, it's an important name. You need to know him. He's the most important name associated with realism, and he's credited with coining the term realism. He was an empiricist. Scientists and positivists believed that the only truth was truth that could be tested with an experiment or at least scientifically observed. Courbet took this approach to art. He rejected the abstract, the visionary, the theoretical. To him, art was about painting the world we live in with all its toil and poverty. So Stonebreakers, which is one of his most famous paintings, is not a sentimental view of country life. This is a hard, sweaty, back-breaking work. And notice how he captures it in dull browns and grays that echo life with a very few pleasures. One of the aspects of reality that realists were unwilling to manipulate was color. So this painting was based on an actual event, the burial of the artist's uncle back in his hometown. But despite the cross carried by a clearly bored and tired attendant, the scene is really bleak and unhopeful, decidedly unheroic, and not, despite the subject matter, especially spiritual. Note that the colors are again dark and somber, with the exception of that splash of color. The clergy may actually be an anti-clerical statement. Only they get to dress up and be in color. Courbet's unsentimental realism bothered the Academy's critics, and so did what they saw as his crude application of paint. So he often scraped paint on with a palette knife. Courbet and other realists admired the loose brushstrokes of Dutch painters and copied this style. I'm going to show you another example of his brushstrokes, but first, let's compare that painting with El Greco's famous painting of a burial, which shows the clergy is deeply involved and concerned, helping the count to the afterlife, if you will. And more significantly, notice how this painting focuses on the promise of a much better life after death. Very different tone. Okay, back to brush strokes. This painting, sorry, I couldn't find a date for it, gives you a much better sense of Courbet's thickly applied paint. The technique, by the way, is called impasto. I couldn't find this term in your textbook, which surprised me. It does show up on at least one AP test, and now you know it, right? So here's another interesting Courbet painting. It's a painting about painting and also a tribute to realism. This was his reality. So who in this room is actually looking at the painting? Not the urbanites on the right, although there's some famous people in that crowd. Not really the oppressed peasants on the left, but the innocent little boy is looking at the painting, and so is the naked model, who some think personifies naked truth, and maybe even anticipates Monet by making a female subject an active participant in the art that portrays her, not just the subject. Now, gleaning is a very unsentimental subject. Gleaners collected the grain left over after the harvesting process. French law protected their right to do this, as the Bible had protected the right of gleaning in ancient Israel. But gleaners were the poorest of the poor. So this painting by Jean-Francois Millet reflects the realist preoccupation with social justice. Millet is important as well because he's one of the founding members of the Barbizon school. This is a group of painters who gathered in the village of Barbizon outside the forest of Fontainebleau near Paris. Some, by the way, those of you who visit us in San Francisco may recall that we saw some Barbizon paintings at the gallery. Not at the art museum, but in the gallery we went to in San Francisco. Anyway, some Barbizon painters were more romantic and sentimental in their tone than Millet, but what they all had in common was a determination to paint nature as the eye actually saw it. They also chose to paint outdoors, en plein air, to use the French term, where they could capture the play of light and color again as the eye actually perceived it. We now see the school as an important precursor of the Impressionists, the last group of painters that we will study in this unit. So here are two more famous paintings by Millet. I especially love the energy and dynamism of the sewer, but note his face is really anonymous. It's hid by that cap. This is the worker as worker. Your textbook doesn't include any works by Corot, but he was another very important member of the Barbizon school. His paintings took a somewhat gentler, more sentimental view of the French countryside. He was also fascinated by the play of light on water, and his work had a lot of influence on Monet. But the realist painters weren't just trying to capture their world accurately, they wanted to change it. Daumier, like Hogarth, you remember the marriage a la mode caricature? Well, he caricatured what he saw as the corruption of the elite, like Hogarth, but his main preoccupation was the oppression of the urban working class. This lithograph captures a chilling event. A member of the civil guard, basically a policeman, was shot by someone from inside a working class tenement. The remaining members of the civil guard stormed into the housing block and basically massacred many of its residents. Now, Honoré Daumier was a journalist, and his prints were reproduced with the new mass media print technique of lithography. You saw that in the last lecture. You saw a brief video, but it was actually focused on using lithography in prints. Lithography was also extremely important because it made mass-produced newspaper art possible, and it also made mass-produced photography through photo offset possible. And so it had a transformative effect as a technology, not only on art, but I would argue even more on journalism. So here's another famous Daumier print, in this case a rendering of Louis Philippe, the bourgeois king brought to power by the Revolution of 1830. He's pictured as a bloated giant, Gargantua as a figure from Renaissance French literature, and here he's shown devouring the riches of his people. This king, by the way, who was brought in by the Revolution of 1830, would be overthrown by the Revolution of 1848. He disappointed people who thought he would turn out to be a liberal leader. The editor of Daumier's newspaper, The Character, was repeatedly tried and even jailed for publishing this kind of work. So here's Daumier's really extraordinarily unsentimental painting. This is a painting, not an etching or a lithograph of a third-class carriage. It's oil on canvas, but you notice that Daumier still relies very heavily on line. He's obviously influenced by his experience as a printmaker. Daumier, in this and many of his works, employs a head-on point of view. These folks look right at us, draw us in to the world that they live in. We're going to see more of this when we get to Monet. Some art historians associate this with the rise of photography, a movement that deeply interested Daumier, who was, after all, a journalist as well as an artist. Notice, too, that the viewers are presumably in the facing seat. The seats are, facing each other in the third-class carriage. Daumier invites us not just to observe, but really to participate in the lives of ordinary people. Finally, notice again that realist painters go out of their way not to manipulate color. We see a lot of earth tones, even in the landscape paintings, and we see fewer attention-getting devices, such as the use of complementary colors. These painters are committed to capturing what the eye sees, not to capturing our attention. So here are some more Daumier paintings of the working class. Note his spare, almost impressionistic style, and again, the rough brushstrokes. The uprising, by the way, was most likely inspired by the Revolution of 1848 in Paris. In February of that year, the quote-unquote citizen king, Louis Philippe, was overthrown. A violent class struggle known as the Bloody June Days followed the coup, and during 3 days of fighting, nearly 10,000 people were killed or wounded, and 11,000 were taken prisoner. Daumier witnessed this killing and the will of the people to fight. Revolts broke out all throughout Europe in 1848, but they were mostly unsuccessful. Rather ironically, the short-lived French Second Republic would lead to the election of Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, who would soon declare himself Emperor Napoleon III. Remember, the College Board loves to ask you about women painters. Rosa Bonheur's realism focused on the world of animals, especially horses. Yet the high drama of her paintings shows a strong romantic influence, and she was a great admirer of Géricault. This was an extremely popular painting in the 19th century. Now we're going to move to the American Realists. This is a school I really like. This painting is by one of America's best-known realist painters, and at first it seems kind of sentimental until you notice that discarded uniform jacket and the canteen in the corner. The fate of soldiers disbanded after the Civil War was a hugely important social and political issue in the years following the conflict. By the way, notice also Homer's use of fairly loose brushstrokes, similar to some of the realist paintings we've seen. And we see it here as well. This was one of several works that Homer, this isn't in your textbook, but I thought it was a very interesting painting. It was one of several works that Homer created during a mid-1870s visit to Virginia, where he had served as a war correspondent during the Civil War. It captures what had to have been an uneasy confrontation. Note that one of the black women remains seated, something that would not have been tolerated in the old days. There's a subtle political message here about the Reconstruction era and an attempt on both sides to adapt to a new social order, but maybe an unwillingness. The mistress doesn't look all that adaptable to me, to change to a world without slavery. Okay, more loose brushstrokes, more impasto. This one isn't in your book either, but it's a famous painting, and I love it. We're getting closer to Impressionism. And finally, this is probably the most famous of Homer's paintings, so I just had to include it. He loved to paint the sea, and few artists do it better. This painting was submitted to and rejected by the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition Art Selection Committee. It was too gory, they said, and, well, just too realistic. By the way, the artist also got some criticism from the medical establishment for showing an operation that paid insufficient attention to sanitary precautions, which were, after all, just beginning to take hold, along with the germ theory of disease. So this one isn't in your textbook, but I thought it was interesting. A few years later, the same artist painted this operation scene, which shows a considerable advance in surgical sanitation, and note the presence of a professional surgical note. Both of these, though, are taken from above, from the gallery, so you have an aerial perspective looking down. Wish I could spend more time on Sargent. I love his portraits, especially his portraits of women and children. If you get to Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts there has a really great collection of his work. So this is an artist I didn't know, which it turns out was my loss, now rectified. Tanner was the first African-American artist to earn international acclaim. He spent most of his working life in Paris, at the time a more welcome place for a person of color. He was a student and protege of Thomas Eakins, whose paintings of operating rooms we just saw, a very important American realist painter. And this is Eakins' portrait of Tanner. It's also another good example of American realist portrait technique. And finally, this is Tanner's most famous painting. Black banjo players, minstrels, were frequently the subject of racial stereotyping. Here, Tanner takes the same theme and renders it intimate and highly personal. I'd originally planned to continue on to Manet, who is either a late realist or an early impressionist or both. Instead, I'm going to cover Monet in my next lecture after a quick look at the so-called pre-Raphaelites.